The banks that facilitate activity, credit also goes flat, and therefore what you end up with is this prolonged period of contraction that occurs that we are still in. So the country needs to have some basic way out of the problem. So in comes the IMF. One of the things you want to tackle is the debt situation. Debt situation is quite bad. So you engineer two basic things to help. One is a lot of the money was being obtained on variable credit, variable rate credit. It was domestic, extremely high interest, so you engineered a swap. The swap generated an improvement in maturity, lower variable rates, and a reduce in the interest expense. What the interest expense did for Jamaica was to help it in terms of getting a little bit of space so that the maturity of the debt literally doubled from 4.5 to about 9 years. The amount of money that they were paying on interest, remember I told you it was about 70%. That was brought down by at least 3 or so percentage points of GDP. You switch from less variable to more fixed percent of your debt, and hopefully that begins to give you a little breathing space. Doesn't solve the problem, a little breathing space. The question about that breathing space is, how do you actually use it going forward? What we can see is everything you do has a counter side. Of course, the banks swapped for lower interest. They increased their maturities. So the banks now pick up a problem, which is lower interest earnings. And that lower interest earnings says that the government is going to get less money in terms of taxes. There's the economy that is weak. You have non-performing loans. As those non-performing loans increase, it means that the bank's balance sheets get also compromised. However, the banks are still doing fairly good. They have high capital adequacy ratios. They are solvent. Some of the things, well, I wouldn't say solvent, but at least capital adequacy ratios are good. Some of the things that Professor Bourne was talking about, maintaining some form of stability. So that becomes another area that we wanted to look at. So the first thing was get some breathing space, make sure the financial system, that's your hub, is actually holding. And then now you need to put in place some additional measures to help the initial problem that you had, which was the debt on the fiscal side. Now, that's where we see the country as of now since the beginning of the program. Exports are beginning to pick up a little. Part of this is arrivals, despite the fact that you had this little breakdown in May and June at the time of the unrest in Kingston. Remittances are picking up, but not as high as they were in 2008. So that your pillars in terms of exports for revenue, your remittances for revenue, such that you have a little more income to be able to spend, that is helping to turn the situation around a little. Inflation is clearly going down for a variety of reasons. One is there's low demand. You have a little appreciation of the exchange rate. You also have import prices that are a little on the lower side. And interest rates that have moved from not the 5 and 10% we saw in Trinidad, but from 20% down to about less than 10% at this point, 8%. Partly because the government needs to borrow less, partly because the debt exchange took place. And as a result of all of this, what we are seeing is the growth rate in the economy is picking up. Now, I'm saying picking up in a very loose sense. If I were to be pirated in from Mars, and I only showed you this, clearly this is growth, right? It's looking upwards. But take a closer look at this side here. This is negative, all right? So we are not growing. We are not growing. We are in negative territory. But the trend is upwards. Rather than -3, we are looking at -1. Okay? So it's growing, but in a very, let me not say in a how way, but I think you get the point. Okay, but there is some light coming out of this, but we're not looking to see us crossing this zero line until probably later in the year or early into next year. So we still have a long way to go. Financial markets are still quite happy about the JDX and about the beginning of the program. We have had bond spreads at 500 basis points down to about just less than 200 basis points, a significant improvement from what we had before. But that is simply markets saying, we think where we are now is on the right track. not that we have solved the problems that we have. That takes me into the issue of IMF performance criteria. What we can say, and the world has been hearing, is Jamaica has been passing all the IMF tests. Yes, it has been passing all the IMF tests, but what tests is it passing? It's passing a test on the fiscal side, it's passing a test on the debt side, and it's passing a test on the arrears side. These are the three parts. Central bank is having money, and domestic assets are not growing too fast. Okay, now that is one thing, and it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. How do you transition from a bad state to a better state? You need to do some adjustment. The bottom line is if the country is in the red, two parts of the country have to make up that red. It's the government and the rest. We live in a democracy. We cannot force the rest to do what we want them to do. But the government can take some of that slack and do some of the changes. And so when you try to get the blend between where you compress and where you push, you need to look at what you can change, what you can encourage, what you can facilitate, but yet you may not be able to engineer the rate of response of those elements to that particular change that you have. So yes, the signs are good. They are sticking with the program. That is confidence enhancing, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. The more that needs to be done partly is to do with structural reforms. And again, some of those reforms are not the entire list of reforms that we would like, but at least these are some of the things that we can do. We can put in place a legal framework, fiscal responsibility framework, that generates commitment to fiscal prudence. We can put in place a treasury management system that would help you to have better control of your public sector. You can put in place tax and customs administration that will help your revenue collection. You could put in place certain tax incentives that could help reduce tax erosion. You could put in place a rationalization plan to help you rationalize your public sector. And you could divest some public enterprises to allow you to have less of a drag. So all of those things are things one can do. They don't all happen overnight. They take time, and you're making choices. On the financial side, which is the hub of whatever takes place, you can look towards putting in place better supervision, stronger capital requirements. You can look at ensuring unlawful organizations are being supervised properly, and you could look at risk-weighting issues for consistency with overall Basel standards. Now, those are not all the things that one can do. You could put in place things to do with business environment, generating enhanced investment. Some of the things that Professor Compton-Bourne spoke about this morning in terms of environment, in terms of ensuring that you have a growth scenario that can actually be sustainable. But again, you can only juggle X balls at one point in time. You can only do it within a specific period in time that you have, and you have to do it within the limited resources that you have at that particular stage. So what risks do we see? There are the external risks that are existing. The global economy. Remember, the US was a dominant partner. You depend on the exports to generate income for Jamaica. Latest 4.8 for the world, 2.6 for the US. Slowing down in 2011. Issues about the fiscal sustainability of stimulus across the world. Banking sector issues. Overall coordination. From the domestic side, what we see is the point which Dillon made, lack of fiscal space. And what you do need is if you contract the government, the private sector needs to pick up the slack. If the private sector is not responding, then you have a problem. Problem is unemployment is going to increase. Balance sheets in the financial sector are going to deteriorate, and you get back into exactly the same cycle that you had. So putting all of this together and getting it to calibrate in a way that is growth enhancing is a big problem. And then you have the shocks that I talked about. Natural disasters. In 1 month or 2 months, we had the Dudas affair. Then we had the courts affair, whereby the court said to the government they needed to honor a wage increase. And then last week, we had the Nicole issue. All of those are things that, of course, again, no matter how well you plan it, the government now needs to find ways of addressing those particular points. Volatility in oil prices, that can affect because we are oil importers, and Alvin will enjoy when they go up as much as we will scream. And then I think you cannot ignore those last 2 points of buy-in, where the entire community buys into the program, and then the social tensions that come with them. We have strikes, we have people who are on the streets. The government needs to take those things into account. And when you think of policy implementation and the formulation of them, you cannot ignore the social side, you cannot ignore the poverty side, you cannot ignore, no matter how you choose to do this, there's fiscal, there is financial, there's real, there's social, and there's all of those things that come together in terms of putting an overall policy program together. So what we say is stakeholders have to stay the course, but for the long haul. Given that there will be quite a rough road in the middle in terms of short term, the government needs to do what it has to do. The regulators, in terms of the financial, need to do some of the things that would engender good macro, stable financial system. But also the private sector needs to play its part in terms of productivity growth. And by that, I'm not just talking depreciation. We're talking real productivity growth, whereby you get more from the same resources, not simply that your price is moving more competitive because of an exchange rate issue. Increasing competitiveness, pushing for overall reforms, I call this advocacy. And then there's the broad issue of building confidence in the general economy. Clearly, it's a very tough challenge. It's a big and arduous road, I think, to put all those things together at one and the same time. But that's exactly the problem that I think you have when you talk of policy formulation and implementation, let alone the overall issues of do you have the institutions, do you have the people, do you have the money to be able to put it in place at one point in time. Thank you very much.